Hi, welcome to Tales of Dread. Tonight marks the start of our series on the United States, Southern Dogmen, and werewolf encounters. This episode takes us through terrifying encounters in Tennessee and North Carolina, so sit back and enjoy the scare. 2002. I am a 32-year-old female from West Virginia's far north. Hancock County has been my home for the majority of my life. We used to camp in tents, walk everywhere, hike in parks, and do other outdoor activities when I was a kid. We started riding horses in state parks when I was in my teens. Tom Wilson Run, Beaver Creek State Park, Salt Fork, Raccoon Creek, and Vista Park are among the places I've visited. And, I believe, that was the name. We had a friend who was always inviting us to ride on other people's property. She'd gotten permission from. I'm very familiar with the local wildlife. I've seen all of the major players, including coy dogs and bears, and I can identify the majority of forest sounds. Nature documentaries are something I enjoy watching. I wanted to be a veterinarian. So I spent a lot of time studying, drawing and painting them. I learned a lot about animal anatomy. Was I ever interested in cryptozoology? Yes, I was a dinosaur-obsessed little girl. My one babysitter had Reader's Digest Mysteries of the Unexplained, and the idea of a plesiosaur in Scotland, or an opossum, or in the Congo was mind-boggling. Later in life, I began to regard it as folklore. It was fascinating to read the accounts and learn the theories behind what people saw, but I believed them about as much as a folklorist believes in dragons and trolls. I had no interest in Bigfoot, and had never heard of the Dogman. I had no desire to look, and the thought never occurred to me. It did seem to me, however, that I didn't need to go looking, even though they found me. We moved to the farm when I was about 10 years old. Mom's dream was to have horses, and she was finally able to live in the farmhouse, which was haunted primarily by former residents. No one was home, no media was on, and yet I was hearing two men talking about how they were going to move the couch and the sound of furniture being dragged right under me. The land itself was strange in its own right. The majority of the time, however, things were fine. We simply shrugged and moved on. I honestly despised our woods everywhere else. I'd freely hike, but even in the yards I felt watched. In fact, now that I think about it, I think something was staring in our windows. Things did slam into our trailer. I believe it was a loose horse, but when I went out to investigate, I couldn't find anything. I'd blame it on a deer. Rather than coming up with names for my horses, I named them after their breeds. Anyone who knew me knew what my horses' names were. I was 18 and 19 at the time of this encounter, and by then we had given up on cows, which I despise, and had only horses and chickens. It was 2 a.m. when someone knocked on the door. I'd only slept for 2 hours, but years of conditioning had my heart racing and my mind racing. Someone knocking so early spelled trouble. It usually meant that horses or livestock had escaped. I wasn't let down. My mind wasn't fully awake, so I didn't think to ask which yard the horses were in when our neighbor said they were in his. My stepfather came out, asked what was going on, and told me to deal with it because they were my horses. Mom was working at the time, which was nothing unusual. 3 of these horses were expert escape artists. I had the routine down. It was dark outside, but there was some moonlight to help. The security light could only go so far. Then, of course, it shut down after a while when it was cloudy, which you could literally have to watch. You didn't just walk into the ravine. It was completely dark. I was in a foul mood, cursing my horses and wondering if some drunk had returned to the fence. Believe it or not, it happened a lot. As I approached the brown barn, I noticed a horse flipping out. It was squealing and carrying on as it ran back and forth. I entered and grabbed the halters and leads, pausing for a moment to see if any other horse or horses had responded to the horse I heard squeal, which would give me an idea of where the other horse or horses might be. It was strange that there was no response. On the other side of the hill, I was thinking nonsense. It was the only reason I could think of for them not responding. Let's just say that when they followed our cut trails to the other side, it took us an hour to traverse the woods and lead them back. That was a crazy track even with two guys on four wheels and my mother. I had the impression that I was being watched and followed. Perhaps it wasn't paranoia. So the land is laid out in this manner. The brown barn was linked to a small pasture about a half-acre long, which then connects to a 7-acre pasture in the center. We converted an old white barn on the outskirts of a large pasture into a run-in. I decided to tackle the horse still on the fence and bring her down to the small pasture to keep her from escaping and possibly attracting the attention of the others. To get to the panicking horse, I had to walk all the way across the pasture. It belonged to my mother's psycho horse. I tried to catch her and almost got trampled a few times. She was frothing at the mouth, and her white eyes were clearly visible. Was I concerned? No. As I previously stated, psycho, I noticed my other 6 were across the street. They were in a small fenced-in area, with a spotlight shining on them. They were motionless, not touching a blade of grass. I was puzzled as to how the neighbor herded them into that tiny fenced-in area with that tiny door. 3 of those horses were taller than 16 hands. One of them was a draft horse cross. The doorway was actually quite small. He went through. My thoroughbred mare took me 2 hours to corral, and the last time she got out, much to my chagrin, she was an awesome jumper. So having a stranger run them up and put them in a tiny yard was mind-boggling. I've had horses since I was 9 years old. I'm 32 now. I've had ponies and horses in the past. I've had several Arabians, draft horses, quarter horses, walking horses, saddlebreds, and other thoroughbreds and mustangs of various breeds. I've had many horses from various backgrounds. I can tell you that no matter what breed they do not like being crammed into small spaces, especially in a group. They were completely silent, and motionless. My neighbor came out and told me that when he found them, they were like that, and he asked if I needed any help, but I said no. My thoroughbred and racking mares disliked men. I told him I'd bring them out one by one. I took one halter and lead and walked the rest of the way outside the gate, putting the halter on my gelding and opening the gate to let them out. They had other plans, however. All 6 of them emerged as a freaking unit. My gelding and Welsh mare were literally chest to chest as we walked back to the brown barn, but crammed together, their chests were pushing against mine. This was unusual for them. I wouldn't normally tolerate such bad behavior. We were on the main road, which bothered me. The speed limit is only 35, but people frequently exceed it. So I attempted to exit through the large pasture gate. They wouldn't even drive on that side of the road, which made me feel a little uneasy. So I led them to the brown barn and they entered. They were wary at first, picking at the hay, I yelled, walking around relentlessly, sticking to the barn like glue and eyeing the upper pasture. I rationalized it by thinking that it was the appy flipping out that was making them nervous, and why hadn't she come down yet? She had to have seen us all walk down the street. I dashed to the gate that separated the small and large pastures. As a matter of habit, I didn't want to hurt myself by returning to the large pasture. I didn't have to be concerned because they didn't follow me like they usually did. The gate was wide open, but the happy was still running around and squealing in the same spot. I started walking towards her. The security lights from my neighbor didn't really illuminate my pasture because the road was higher than my pasture, casting it in shadow. Though she took off at a panic gallop, swerved sideways, and jumped the stream, I can make out her shape in some detail. She nearly landed on her face when she landed, but she caught herself and took off at a dead gallop. Again. I hid behind a stump. I would have been killed if she had hit me. I returned and changed the gate. I decided not to inspect her until I had the halters and leads. I decided to walk on the road instead of the pasture because she was too hot. The pasture wasn't even dark and springy. However, clouds had taken over the sky at some point during this, so there was no moonlight to be seen. The spot on the road where I was paved and fairly well lit, though my neighbor was concerned. I was almost to the white barn when I felt compelled to pause and inspect a specific spot in the pasture. I'd like to say instinct told me to look, but usually I'd scan the woods first, to see if anything was watching me. This is usually where the observers are. Instead, I simply turned on my flashlight in a specific location. It was very close to where the mare was yelling. I noticed red eyes shine. My first thought was, why would a deer be there in the middle of all that chaos? I was feeling a sense of extreme dread and didn't know why, other than the fact that my horse was going insane told me something else wasn't right. I then realized the position of the eyes in relation to the walnut trees and my racing barrels. The road is visible above the pasture, and the walnut trees are at the same elevation as the road. The pasture itself is sloped to deal with road runoff. The barrel next to it was at the bottom of the incline. Because the barrels were white, I could see a dim light for my flashlight on one of them. It was too big to be a deer right next to this thing. I was frozen as I stood there watching it. I just had a feeling it was evil, so I had to keep an eye on those eyes. It was staring at me. It blinked a few times, slowly. It also had a view of the woods above the pasture. I know you ask your guests if they ever have the impression that there are other people out there. Let me tell you something. With a sinking stomach, it crossed my mind. I shined my flashlight through the trees to see if I could catch anything. I stand out. But I didn't see any, so I returned to the eyes. They were still there, and I flicked back and forth to make sure nothing was approaching me. I'm not sure how long I stood there frozen. Someone could have rounded the corner and hit me with her car. I was completely focused. It finally began to move away. It cast a few sidelong glances at me. I believe it ended up in the woods around the creek. The horses were still restless and making noise, so I didn't hear anything surprising. I stood there for quite some time after searching for the eye shine. I was thinking it might have been a bear. I don't think so, even though the eyes were the same height until they vanished. On this uneven inclined ground, bears are clumsy on their back legs. I have no doubt a bear would have dropped to all fours, even the rear up and down behavior bears exhibit when trying to see. Something was wrong. We've had one cross our pasture before, and he made quite a racket as he made his way through the woods. With the bear, the horses settled down faster. At this point, I was almost to my neighbor's house, and I considered leaving the couple $100 attack at his house. I knew if I left them there, they'd be gone in the morning and my mother would be furious. So I dashed over, grabbed them, and ran like hell. I should have abandoned the attack. I know you're not supposed to run, but I couldn't believe what I'd just witnessed. I entered the barn via the tack room and hung out with the horses. I wasn't going to walk back up that pitch-black driveway. I figured the horses would serve as a warning, and the barn was full of sharp objects. I didn't get back up until the sun came up. By that point, I was frozen stiff. I've had years to think about it. It frightens me that whatever it was staring at me for however long. How long had that thing been there that was preventing Happy Mare from falling? Was it in the shadows while I was attempting to catch her, or was it in the dark barn? To get to the road, I walked through. Was it? Appy swerved and nearly fell because of this. How did my horses escape? I never learned how they got out. Did they get scared and jump? Sadly, I checked the fence line away from the woods and looked for other tracks around the barrel. The ground was hard from frost in the morning, but after the Appy man ran for a while, the ground was severely torn up and turned into a muddy mess. I'm sure she was the one who woke the neighbor up on this particular day. I'm not sure what I was feeling or experiencing. I just hope it never comes back around to bother my horses again. The year is unknown. My stepfather moved to Virginia when he was about 8 years old, right on the edge of the Great Desolate Swamp. He was in bed one night when the sky was cloudless or very bright, according to him. He had never considered whether the moon was shining or not until he noticed a beast peering through his window. He claimed to see spittle running down its face and that its eyes were fixed on him. It was said to be standing on its hind legs with cream, red, and brown matted fur and a face that resembled a wolf except for the snout. It had very human-like facial features. Its jawbones were high, and the structure around its eyes, as well as the eyes themselves, were human-like, with yellow coloring. I think this is interesting and possibly valid because the Great Dismal Swamp covers a large area, and is rarely touched by humans. Only recently have people begun to investigate its inhabitants. The grounds are wet and mossy, and they absorb sound well. It has been reported that people have wandered into it and never returned. Who knows what might be lurking in the shadows? It chills my bones just thinking about it. Yeah, I forgot to mention that when they looked around the house in the morning, he crawled out of his bed and went straight to his mother's room. Ground was stirred up beneath all of the windows, and grass was yanked out. There were actual scratches in the wood beneath his window, as well as missing paint. However, there were no discernible footprints as far as they could see. Date of story 3 is unknown. I just thought I'd mention it as a possible dog. Multiple co-workers of mine were sighted in a Shelby County, Tennessee medical facility. Behind the facility, I heard a strange creature screaming and making crystal clear sounds. It is well lit and fenced, but there are woods behind it and a river bottom nearby. 3 different people have heard the noise, 2 at the same time and 1 earlier last summer. When discussing it, the most recent event occurred within the last month. The third person asserts confidently that they, too, heard the noise in the early morning house while retrieving something from their vehicle and couldn't believe it. So, after hearing the details of what the other 2 heard, they never mentioned it to anyone. The third person revealed that all 3 are medical professionals with outdoor experience who are unable to identify the creature making the noises. They described it as loud and crystal clear, And despite its obvious distance, the call was loud enough to be heard clearly from within a running car with the defroster blowing. This happened around 6 to 7 am at twilight. Also, because this happened near shift change, there were several ladies arriving at work who obviously heard the noise and rushed inside the building, as observed by the two leaving story for date unknown laugh at me. I don't give a damn. I'm not sure what I saw, but it appeared to be a cross between a man and a wolf. I don't shit you. I was driving home from work. I was about 10 minutes away from the house, climbing a large hill. I got a strange feeling and slowed down, thinking a deer was going to appear out of the woods or something. I just had the impression that I was being watched or followed. There were no cars ahead of or behind me. I got to the top of the hill and slammed on my brakes because as soon as I got there, this huge black hairy thing came bounding across the road. It was so big that when it ran, its back arched up, kind of like a cheetah but much bigger. I'm sure if it had stood up, it would have been well over 6 feet tall, if not taller. I also know another vehicle attempted to do so because when I hit the brakes, another vehicle turned onto that road and slammed on their brakes as well. We both just sat there for a few minutes, which was not particularly safe given the circumstances. I understand, but we were in shock. I have absolutely no idea what I saw. It wasn't a cat or a dog. Dogs do not grow to be that big, or arch their backs like this thing did when it ran. Its arms and legs, or whatever it had, were so long that it had to throw them out to the side, kind of like a crab walk, just to run, and the appendages it had were just as big as it was. It ran non-stop from one side of the woods to the other. It seemed to be either pursuing or fleeing from something. I have no idea what the holy freaking hell I saw, and I don't care if you laugh at me. I know what I saw in Story 5 of 2012, and I'd like to tell you about an encounter my son had about 4 years ago. He'd told me about it back then, but I had no idea what it was. We've had Dogman encounters, and now I know what happened. Around 11 p.m., my son's friend was driving him home through a rural residential neighborhood. The houses are set back from one another. They were driving on a 2-lane highway with no street lights and little traffic. The area is not densely forested, but it does have patches of trees and fields. This area is most likely part of the Smoky Mountain foothills. Anyway, they were driving along when this thing sprang out from the right side of the road and was across the road and into the bushes on the other side in just 2 leaps or bounds or steps or whatever you want to call it, and it was in full view due to their headlights. My son stated that the first thing that came to mind was a dog. He went on to say that it was running like a deer on all fours. He described it as a deer with a huge dog head, massive shoulders, and a really small waist. He kept emphasizing how large it was. So I asked for a comparison, if he met something huge, like a big deer, or if it was as tall as a cow. He responded, and I'll quote him, "Mom, this thing was massive. If we had hit it, the car would have gone underneath it and hit the windshield. I'm not sure what kind of car it was, but it was about the size and shape of an older Sentra. He stated that he and his friends were silent for about 10 seconds before his friend yelled, "Did you see that?" My son said yes, and they didn't say anything else the rest of the way. It's very creepy to me, and I thought other listeners might be interested in hearing about it. 6th of July, 1990. I was about 9 years old at the time and was at my mother's friend's house for a small get-together. My mother's best friend decided to go get something from a house nearby down a dirt road in the woods. My mother's friend decided to bring me and another friend with her. I wish I hadn't gone with her over there, and when she got out, my friend and I stayed in her car and waited for her to return. We decided to get out of her car after sitting in it for 10 minutes to see what was taking her so long, but she told us to get back in. As it turned out, she was buying marijuana, so we weren't welcome in the house. So my friend and I climbed back into her car and waited for her to emerge. On that property, there were a lot of bulldogs. The dogs had all been barking like crazy before suddenly stopping and going into their dog houses. That's when my friend and I noticed what appeared to be a werewolf emerging from behind the car. We froze and just stared as it passed by, thinking, "Wow, it looks so evil and demonic." We ducked down and lay on the floorboards for what seemed like an eternity until we heard my mom's friend banging on the driver's window, pleading with us to let her in. It must have left when I heard her leave the house or something. Who knows, maybe it was just waiting for the right moment to strike. Story number 7 on the night of my brief encounter. During the slow parts of my night, it was unusually slow. I park outside the facility where I work and observe the wildlife. It's teeming with fox, coyotes, raccoons, and every now and then, I'll spot a red wolf breaking the wood line and trotting across an open field in search of small game. Our facility is on a dead-end street that backs up to a major creek, with a smaller creek to the left that branches off to the larger one. A large river about a mile away feeds both creeks. I should also mention that we have large patches of woodland that lead to our facility, and the area does not have much light until you turn into the parking lot. About a week before my encounter, I would sit at the end of the road to complete my paperwork and wait for the next call. I had the feeling I was being watched as I parked there. I'd look up, almost expecting to see someone standing in front of my truck. Let me state unequivocally that darkness or the woods do not frighten me in the least. I was raised in a swamp near a river and prefer the solitude. Not only did I have a sense of being watched and sharing my space with someone, but there were no normal night sounds like crickets and frogs. I was also perplexed by the fact that all of the wildlife appeared to have vanished from the area. This bothered me greatly, and I couldn't figure it out that night. I had my meeting. I decided to leave some wet dog food near the wood line in the hopes of luring a family of raccoons out so I could check on them. This family of raccoons I had watched grow up from kids bothered me, as did the absence of a grey fox that frequented the area. This fox would come within 4 to 5 feet of you but would be constantly guarded. He'd hang out with certain people before retreating into the woods. Anyway, I popped the top off some stinky dog food, and as I was pulling the top off, I heard a deep growl come from the wood line. I'd never heard an animal growl with such power and intensity. I initially assumed it was a jailbreak from the interstate, which can be heard from our facility, but that was not the case. I could feel it hitting my face from the wood line and felt the growl inside my chest almost like a vibration. I recognized this wasn't a bear in the same way that someone recognizes their left hand from their right. You already know, and yes, there is a bear here. But I can tell you the truth in a friendly and direct manner. This was not a bear or any other type of wildlife native to the area. I lowered my head and refused to look up. I thumped a can of food on the ground, hoping that whatever was in the wood line would prefer the can of food over me. I walked away from the food, my head down, until I arrived at my truck. My instinct told me to leave. I returned about a half hour later, my curiosity having triumphed over my common sense. As a natural skeptic, I was ready to investigate the previous incident because I had parked in the same spot and had walked to the back of my truck to smoke. While standing there, I noticed a dark mass come across the road and disappear into an open field that is mostly overgrown with wild, blackberry bushes and grass. I have a keen eye. I have a keen eye. I take in a lot of information, but I had to admit that I suffer from short-term memory loss as a result of a TB. That was the end of my law enforcement career. But what I saw at that precise moment will live on in my memory for the rest of my life. I can only describe this creature as what I assumed to be a hybrid at the time. Despite the fact that it was on all fours, it did not appear natural to me in any way. It moved in quick, fluid motions. In retrospect, I was most surprised by the creature's intelligence in attempting to appear natural. Something was wrong with its gait, but it appeared that its front legs were pulling its body forward. The shoulders were hunched, and the back was long. The creature was black, and I can only describe it as a dark mass with no reflection. I also noticed that it was holding a small animal in its mouth. The strange thing was that I could see the definition of most of the small animals in comparison to the darkness of the creature I now assumed to be a Dogman. The snout was long but comfortable. The most striking feature of its body was its ears. I guess with my background working with dogs, the ears were clearly defined to me. They were folded back, like you might see on a Dutch Shepherd or even a German Shepherd. I'm not sure what color its eyes were or what kind of tail it had. I just remember it being there 1 minute and gone the next. When daylight came, I looked for tracks, but I trusted my instincts and did not go into that field looking for them. The ground leading out of the smaller creek was overgrown with grass and dirt. There was difficulty. I was perplexed, but more amazed than anything else. For several months, I sat on my experience. I kept it a secret from everyone. I then began looking up what I had seen on the internet. I suppose in my head, I wondered if it was some kind of man-made hybrid creature that had escaped. I searched the internet for several sites, but none seemed to come close to what I had seen. Nothing until I came across a picture of what appeared to be a dog man. If you take what I saw and stand it upright instead of on all fours, that's exactly what I saw. I believe this dog man was a young adult, as he wasn't particularly large. The fact that the dog man had to catch my scent before clearing out the wood line is what I think about the most. I know who sent it. I understand how it works. The dog man was aware of my presence before emerging from the woods. That, I suppose, will be the answer. I'll never have it. After a few months of keeping my experience to myself, I spoke with a few of my co-workers. Of course, they told me it was a bear or a large wolf, but they did admit that the wildlife had gone missing for a while. I was told to tell my story, but I believe it was only to make my co-workers laugh behind my back. I stand by what I saw, despite the fact that I don't talk about it much because of people like him. As I write this, I'm back on the night shift, parked in the same spot where my encounter occurred. I believe the dog man has left the area. The wildlife has returned, and the night sounds are all around. I suppose. I'll always wonder if it'll return, but I doubt I'll ever walk through the woods at night by myself looking for animal tracks again. Now there are encounters from Missouri, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Let us enter the swamps of the South and prepare for the next round of werewolf and dogma encounters on November 19, 2015. I was putting the trash cans out for collection the next day. Because it was late, I grabbed a flashlight. I went out the back door, unlocked the gate, and dragged the can backwards as I passed the fence, which blocked my view of my neighbor's garage. That's when my light struck this wolf-like creature. I instantly froze. When our gazes met, the creature turned to its right, fell to all fours, and leapt my neighbor's driveway in a single solid leap. The driveway is approximately 12 feet wide. The creature stood about 8 feet tall and cost around 300 pounds. It appeared thin around the waist, but it was extremely muscular. When I dropped the trash can, panic set in. I dashed inside, took my gun, and locked myself in my room. I've never felt such terror before. When the light hit its eyes, they turned a bright yellow and became menacing. His fur was short and dark in color. I could hear his claws clicking, and when he dropped down on all fours, I thought I was seeing things and didn't sleep a wink that night. It made me seriously doubt my sanity. It also prompted me to apply for a concealed carry weapons permit. I heard something whimpering a few nights ago. I slammed my window shut and turned on the lights just as it started to get dark. Story 2, I stayed in bed with my AR-15 all night. The year is unknown. I should begin by stating that my partner and I are experienced Bigfoot investigators who are in a unique situation due to the presence of a family group in our research area. My partner and I were on our hilltop last October during the full moon, and we had a lot of success with 2 juveniles and 1 adult that we noticed. We could hear them walking through the leaf litter and occasionally hearing clacks or knocks from various directions. After a while, it appeared that their sense of fun had worn off and they had become far more cautious. Mike thought he heard something to our north and went down to investigate, while I stayed near the camp to ensure it wasn't a diversion. He returned in a hurry, saying he saw one of the young ones come out of the woods line and run for the other side of the fire break, and what happened after that he couldn't understand. It stood about 6 feet tall and had pointy ears, and a long snout. At this point, I must state that neither of us subscribes to the Dogman, Wolfman, Grassman theory. We simply assumed it was a misidentification of a Bigfoot or a bear. I'd bought a .40 caliber handgun, and some hydro-shock ammunition earlier that day. So it was in my car after Mike told me what he had seen. I retrieved my weapon and loaded it while doing so. We could hear the 2 little ones babbling and the big ones stomping all the way to her backside. They were irritated or upset about something, and they never acted like that around us. I had Mike take me down the firebreak to where he saw this creature, and we scanned the entire area with spotlights. In a few short growls, we could hear something moving around. Finally, Mike caught it with the spotlight moving between trees, and what I saw was something I could only imagine seeing on the big screen, a 6-foot wolf walking on its hind legs. When I fired my weapon into the air, it turned southeast into the woods. We returned to camp with caution, but we could hear this thing pacing us to our left. As we returned to camp, we kept hearing something approaching us from the woods. Mike turned on the spotlight, and I aimed my gun at the source of the noise. It was approaching us without fear, and it seemed to be stalking both of us, despite the fact that Mike had only seen one of our juvies. It appeared from between the trees, and I hit it square in the ribs from about 20 yards away. We measured the following day, and I am a very good shooter. I saw the wound and knew I had hit the son of a bit. It landed on the ground, but immediately stood up and ran southeast. We could hear it crash through the brush and even hear it fall down or trip over something, but it continued down the hill paralleling the fire break in a southerly direction. We were both terrified by this point, so we broke camp and left the next morning. I loaded up a few extra clips and we went back to see if it had died nearby or was only wounded. So we felt compelled to find it. We tracked it all the way down the canyon from where I shot it to where it caused such a commotion. When it fell, the leaf litter was everywhere and was fairly easy to find. We did a perfect canine track in the mud ridge at one point, but it was over 8 inches across. What perplexed us both was that there was no blood trail at all, literally none. We both saw the bullet hit, but there was no blood. We followed it all the way down the canyon until we lost sight of it. We asked a Native American couple we know, and they said skinwalker right away. We contacted a few other investigators to figure out what had happened and what we were dealing with. I previously stated that neither of us took any religion from any Dogman reports, but I do know that neither of us wants to go through it again, and I have never been out in the woods. 3 years ago, almost 3 years ago, it was almost fall. I was on my way up to pick up my husband from his mother's house, which was about an hour away from where we live. It was very dark. The road had recently become a gravel road. On one side, there are woods, and on the other, there is a creek and a commercial farm. This dark grey thing jumped across the road from the creek. I can see its back end, but I definitely saw a dog's tail. I told him and his mother that I saw a donkey running across the road in front of me, but its tail resembled that of a dog. I was mocked for it, but I did stop my car and get out to look for the animal, thinking someone had lost a pet. A car pulled up, but continued on its way. I was hoping they'd come to a halt and ask me what was going on. But that did not occur. I stood there for a few seconds, thinking it was a bad idea. After all, many horror films begin in this manner. But that was the end of the fourth sighting story. In a field, I saw 3 of them eating something large and bloody. When they saw me stop eating, they followed me back to the farm. This happened to me more than 50 years ago when I got out of there. It was forbidden to discuss in the family lest the neighbors think we were crazy. Now that all the old folks have passed away, I've told my children about what I witnessed that day. They suggested I write it down, but I think I'll leave that to them. There were other strange things going on in the area, but we didn't connect the dots at the time. Even if the aunts and uncles were aware of what was going on, they would not tell us kids anything. It's been cathartic to talk about them, and I'm glad to see that others have seen them as well. But I have to tell you that remembering something I've tried to forget for over 50 years is a nightmare. It was terrifying. I haven't been able to get a good night's sleep because of all the gore and those things' faces. I honestly believe they would have eaten me if they hadn't already. When I finally told them where I was and what had happened, they called me a bald-faced liar and beat me up. Then the people went to the field into the truck that I had hidden and saw the gore, blood, scratches, prints and everything. Later an uncle up the road about 5 miles had these prints come up to his house. He took pictures of them, and there was a newspaper article about some sort of huge cat prowling around. I'm not sure if that has anything to do with those critters. A neighboring farm, owned by a wealthy family in comparison to us, had reported the missing bowl. That had to have something to do with it. He was a huge, rambunctious creature. They never discovered anything. I know this is choppy and unclear, but even after all this time, Story 5 still makes me nervous to talk about. This happened around 2 a.m. in early December 2011. Our friend and I were sitting in my bedroom hanging out in the morning when we both noticed something moving on my surveillance monitor. I had a camera pointed down my driveway so I could see when visitors arrived. When we both looked, I saw what appeared to be a large canine on all fours and in the middle of a run. This thing stood up on its hind legs and ran across my field, down my driveway, and into my brother's field on two legs. I was stunned, and my friend turned to me with her mouth wide open. I inquired, "What did you just see?" And she responded, "Well, what did you see?" I could see where this was going. So I asked her how many legs it was running on. And she simply replied that it was running on all fours but had dropped to two. I felt a cold chill run through my body as I realized she had seen exactly what I had. I jumped up, grabbed my recently purchased night vision scope, and dashed to the front of my door, my friend close behind. I must admit that I was hesitant to open that door for fear of it being there. So I opened the door with a roar, hoping to startle it if it was there. But it wasn't the case. Hey, I had no idea. I stepped out onto my front porch with caution, grabbed the scope, and scanned the front field. There was nothing to be seen, and I had no idea which direction it was going except where I had last seen it, so I waited until daybreak and went out to where it crossed my driveway, where I found a paw print that was a good 12 inches by 12 inches. I was taken aback. I simply stood there, staring back at the woods. It had come from the north and was heading south. I couldn't save the print and didn't think to take a photo at the time. From what I could see on camera, neither my camera nor I were recording at the time of the sighting. This thing had a massive upper body. I recall seeing the muscles flex and the muscularity in its upper back. It was running in weeds that reached my waist as it reached full height. But it was a good 2 feet above them on all fours. And because the camera only showed black and white when it reached full height, I would estimate it to be around 8 feet tall. I didn't get to see its color, but I can tell you it's dark. Its head is bizarre. And that stands out because I could see the snout and the pointed ears that were laid back whenever it moved, to 2 legs. I identify as an R&D technician, so I'm trained to pay attention to details. And, despite the fact that this thing was moving faster than any human, I was so transfixed on its form and what I was seeing that it was heading south and into property that connects to Stennis Space Center's buffer zone, which is just over 100,000 acres of untouched and uninhabited acreage in Hancock County that has been set aside exclusively for the Space Shuttle program since the mid-1960s. So it has everything it needs to survive in those woods while remaining undetected. I've always enjoyed being outside, but since that sighting, I won't go out in the woods without a gun. Now I'm certain I don't want to run into that thing. 6th story up close and personal. This will be a brief summary because writing about the entire experience here would take far too long. On July 4, 2016, just a few days ago, 2 girlfriends and I decided to raft down the Chattahoochee River and spend time at the Diving Rock, laughing at all the drunks having a good time. This is a summer tradition in North Georgia, going all the way back to the 1960s. I am now 47 years old. But in my youth, I did it several times and nearly drowned doing a gainer off the diving rock when I landed on my belly and hailed some water. I was fairly drunk and don't remember how I got back to the surface, but my upper body and internal organs were purple the next day. They were painful for several weeks. That year, the river was extremely low. Oh, I wish I could say it was 1988. As a result, the big, flat rock was at least 25 feet above the river. Most people backed down once they got up there. So, after at least 28 years, we were back this past Monday. But now that I've been sober for well over a decade and haven't touched alcohol, I had to answer nature's call number 2. So, with nothing but my bathing suit, I had to walk very far back into the dense woods because of all the people, about 15 or so, waiting to jump. I walked much further in order to find something resembling toilet tissue. Finally, after reaching a small clearing surrounded by old-growth pines, I began doing my business while squatting in a very vulnerable position. Out walks an enormous canine-type creature in broad daylight. Now, I must tell you that I spent 21 years in the army, serving in 3 different theaters of war around the world. And I'd never even heard of this creature. I haven't slept in 3 days because I've been researching everything in a zombified state. In my own vomit, I can still taste the fear in my throat. I am 6 feet tall and weigh about 250 pounds. And as a former college and semi-pro football player and power lifter, this thing dwarfed me at least 7 feet 6 inches tall and cost about 400 pounds. I'm familiar with large people, as well as strength and musculature, and this was no ordinary creature that evolved in that environment. This is a genetically modified hybrid of man, wolf, and primate. My experience with it only lasted a few minutes, but it displayed strange behavior and vocalized several times at me. It stank so bad and terrified me so much that I retched repeatedly. I had been gone for so long that the girls came looking for me, and they were the ones who finally scared this thing away when they found me, trembling and unable to speak as a combat lifesaver in the army. I can tell you that every joint in my body was in shock as a result of this, and my ab muscles are still sore after 3 days. So I'd be more than willing to share everything with you in the hopes of relieving my anxiety, but I'm just expressing my trauma because I'm not sure what type I saw, but I can promise you that this is not something anyone would want to go through again. I am not grateful or privileged, and I will not pursue this thing with a camera story on September 7, 2015. This happened 3 weeks ago while my fiancé and I were driving home from an event. When we hit the road this night, it was already dark and raining. I was driving and my fiancé was in the passenger seat. We had only been driving for about 15 minutes. When we arrived at a stretch of road where I had noticed a rather large figure in the opposite lane of the two-way road. It was greyish in colour and appeared to be on all fours. Given the circumstances, it was surprising how quickly it happened. After all, I had inquired about it with my fiancée. She just said yes, but she seems nervous about it. I wanted to pull over but couldn't because another car was only about 100 feet behind us. I also didn't look back because I didn't want to be distracted by that. Because of the poor road conditions and the fact that we were in an area we had never visited before that night, I would rather concentrate on the road. From what I saw, I don't believe it was a cow. Even from what I could see of it, its hair was more canine-like than anything else. I'd guess it was either a dog, a man, or a Bigfoot. I wish I could have gotten a better look at it during the day because it was right outside my door. However, because it happened so quickly and because I kept my focus on the road rather than turning to look at it, I didn't notice it right away. That pretty much sums up my encounter in Story 8. In November of 2017, there were poultry farms east of Shreveport. There have been reports of Dogman encounters on this farm, including footprints, dead chickens, sightings, and farmers shooting at the creature with shotguns, rifles, and pistols, as captured on video by one of the farm's overseers. What's worse is that several other farms in the area have had werewolf encounters, which is bad for business. We need wildlife agents to deal with tracking them down to their layer of residence and killing them. The number of incidents is increasing. These farmers do not want their lives torn apart by these dogmen, and if they are not dealt with immediately, they will only cause more damage by broadcasting information about these demons and their actions to the general public. They are not informed, and the captors who predominate are unchecked by the majority of the farmers and residents in the area. This story should serve as a wake-up call to the law enforcement community, local farmers, and citizens to take a stand against these werewolf dogman things. Story number 9. As members of the county parish SWAT team and law enforcement officers, we spend a significant amount of time training in the bayous and wooded areas surrounding Shreveport, Louisiana. It is necessary to crawl through dense woods, creeks, and bayou settings. My friend and Deputy Gemini, sir, couldn't believe what we saw last week in the swamp. We crept up on a dogman-looking werewolf-like creature near the old rice mills and took some photos of the area. We were absolutely terrified. So we kept our distance and watched it as it walked around on its hind legs. So we went to investigate and watch it as it closed in on us. We decided to take the creek to beat the dog out of our camp, because it was heading for our training area. The dogman, werewolf thing came up the fence line and then hid in the shrubbery to watch us. Jim, my partner, looked around over its head and saw the reaction. So the dog critter walks away towards the woods from where he came. Another one up the old road was on the lookout for us. We sat down and used our scopes to track the dogman's movements, as he approached us. He came to a halt in the middle of the road, only 7 feet away from us. He sniffed the air, looking for a scent. We didn't move for an entire minute. He then went to his friend, and the two of them walked away into the woods. Even though we were armed and ready to kill, Jim and I were terrified of them. We waited 5 minutes before going to our vehicles to write a report on this incident, which our supervisors dismissed as nonsense and said he would see us again on Monday morning. So we had our encounter, having no idea what these creatures were or what to do with them. When we return to the dark Louisiana bayous, we will think twice. Thank you and stay safe. Story the 10th of May 2010. Hunter Bone, my German Shepherd, hunting dog, and I went early this morning at 5:45 along the old abandoned railroad bridge that crosses the bayou near my home in Crowley. Louisiana's population is 70,526 people. Because it was early, there was a human fog and it was dark enough that I couldn't see anything. Hunter Bones stopped and looked ahead down the rails as we walked slowly in between the rails of this old set of rusty railroad tracks, as if he heard or sensed something with nothing in sight. We continued on until Hunter Bone abruptly stopped. Once more. What exactly is it, boy? A raccoon or a rabbit, perhaps? What? Suddenly, a huge hairy dog thing emerged from the fog, standing on its hind legs upright. Shit. I was terrified and fearful, so I pulled out my Remington 12 gauge and fired 2 rounds of buckshot over the wolf's head, bam bam. Hunter Bone and I ran back towards the pickup, and I had turned about 50 yards to fire 2 more rounds for insurance, so we would make it home. We hauled body fast back to the main road that leads to Crowley as soon as we got in the truck. As we approached an Exxon gas station, I noticed a Louisiana state trooper and told him about my ordeal. He said he's had hairy dog creatures run in front of his cruiser at night, which frightened him, but the thing always disappears into the woods or jumps off the road. Okay, I'm going to go home and relax later. As I sat in my house, I tried to make sense of what had just happened to me. And why, for one thing, after 25 years of biohunting, had I never heard of or even seen this creature. This experience will discourage me from hunting alone in the future. This definitely jangled my chain. And if you're going to hunt in the south of Louisiana by yourself, I recommend you do so. You had better be ready as well. So, sir, be safe and vigilant. Story the 11th of April 18th, 1998. An old nursery is about 2 miles down the railroad tracks. Ziegler's Plant Nursery. The old couple, the Zieglers, are no longer alive. However, the 5-acre homestead is now owned by Dr. Artel, a veterinarian who lives on the property. The previous owners reported werewolf creatures jumping a fence in broad daylight in front of their children, who jumped on top of the car spellbound. In later encounters, the werewolf excrement poop was found on the front porch. The state wildlife authorities arrived and filed the report, but they were unable to identify the poop or paw prints as listed in any logged, familiar comparison to known species. So it turns out that this homestead was built on an Indian burial ground. Assume I called Mrs. Ziegler after her husband died. As of 2010, she claimed to have a loaded firearm and a holy cross in each room. Ms. Ziegler died as well. I went to the Crowley barbershop recently, and an elderly gentleman told me that he used to be the gardener maintenance and grass mower at the Ziegler plant nursery many years ago, and that when he went inside the house, objects would move on their own, furniture and beads would shake violently, and crosses would spin on the walls. Obviously, there appears to be some strange link between the paranormal and these werewolf creatures. Please subscribe, leave a comment, and like if you can, as it greatly helps me. There are many great encounters to come, and many of you have requested more parts for the other Dogman series, such as the Eastern and Western encounters. And I assure you that I have many good things in the works for you. More parts will be released, as well as a slew of other exciting encounters. Keep an eye out.